January 17, 1942, Bataan Peninsula, Philippine Islands. The tropical air hung thick with moisture and the stench of burning oil. Through the canopy of mahana wood trees, Japanese Lieutenant Colonel Masanobu Tsuji watched American and Filipino defenders retreat toward the southern tip of the peninsula. His boots, still relatively clean despite weeks of campaign, pressed into soil that had absorbed the blood of 3 nations. He had expected chaos. He had expected the dissolution of military order that came with defeat, the panic, the abandonment of wounded, the self-preservation that consumed armies in their final hours. What he witnessed instead would haunt his understanding of warfare for the remainder of his life. The Americans were losing. This much was undeniable, but they were not breaking. To understand what Lieutenant Colonel Tsuji and thousands of Japanese officers experienced in those early months of the Pacific War requires stepping back into the ideology that had shaped them. The Imperial Japanese Army of 1941 was built upon a foundation of spiritual superiority that transcended mere tactical doctrine. Since the Meiji Restoration, Japanese military philosophy had elevated the concept of Yamato Damashi, the spirit of ancient Japan, above material considerations. This was an army that had defeated the Russians at Mukden, that had seized Manchuria, that had endured the grinding campaigns of China through sheer will and the acceptance of death as the ultimate expression of loyalty to the emperor. In the military academies of Tokyo and the training grounds of the home islands, young officers learned that Western soldiers were fundamentally weak. They had grown soft in their democracies, corrupted by individualism and material comfort. The Americans especially were portrayed as a mongrel nation without the purity of blood and purpose that gave the Japanese their strength. American soldiers, they were taught, would crumble when faced with true believers, men who had transcended the fear of death. This was not mere propaganda, this was doctrine, repeated and reinforced until it became indistinguishable from truth. When Japanese forces landed in the Philippines on December 22, 1941, they expected validation. The American garrison, caught unprepared by the attack on Pearl Harbor, had indeed retreated. MacArthur's forces had abandoned Manila and withdrawn into the Bataan Peninsula, giving ground with each passing day. By every metric that mattered in the Japanese tactical manual, this was the beginning of collapse. The defenders were cut off, outnumbered, and facing an enemy that had conquered half of Asia in a single winter. But something was wrong. Captain Hideo Ohira, commanding a company in the 65th Brigade, recorded his confusion in a diary later captured by American forces. His entry from January 23, 1942, describes an attack on a defensive position near the Abuke line. His men had charged with fixed bayonets, screaming, embodying the offensive spirit that had carried them across China. They expected the Americans to flee. Instead, the Marines in the position, men from the 4th Regiment who had been stationed in Shanghai before the war, remained in their foxholes and delivered disciplined, aimed fire until the Japanese were forced to withdraw, leaving 17 dead in the kunai grass. What disturbed Captain Ohira was not the firepower, it was the control. The Americans had not panicked, they had not wasted ammunition. Even as the Japanese assault reached within meters of their positions, the Marines had maintained fire discipline, taking aimed shots, covering one another's reloads with practiced precision. When the attack faltered and the Japanese fell back, the Americans did not pursue recklessly. They held their positions, reorganized, and waited. This was not how defeated armies behaved. Major Kiyoshi Kamiko, a staff officer who would survive the war and later teach at Japan's National Defense Academy, interviewed dozens of company and platoon leaders during the Bataan campaign. His report, compiled in February 1942, reveals a pattern of cognitive dissonance spreading through Japanese ranks. Officers described American positions that fought with coordination they associated with elite units, not a retreating colonial garrison. They noted that American wounded were carried from the battlefield, a practice that the Japanese considered a tactical luxury, a waste of manpower that revealed misplaced priorities. Yet somehow this supposed weakness did not translate to collapse. The discipline manifested in unexpected ways. Japanese soldiers accustomed to night infiltration tactics that had terrorized Chinese forces found themselves facing Americans who had established watch rotations so effective that surprise attacks repeatedly failed. Sentries stayed awake. Passwords changed regularly. When Japanese soldiers attempted to sow confusion by calling out in English, the Americans responded with immediate fire rather than hesitation. In one incident recorded by multiple Japanese sources, a patrol from the 20th Infantry Regiment attempted to infiltrate American lines near Mount Samat. The Japanese soldiers had observed the position for 2 days. Noting the routines, planning their approach, they moved in darkness, using skills honed through years of training. Yet within minutes of penetrating the perimeter, coordinated fire from multiple positions illuminated the night. The patrol was destroyed. What stunned the survivors was not the violence, but the speed of the American response, the way individual Marines immediately knew their sectors of fire, the way they communicated without shouting, the way the entire defensive system activated like a single organism. This was the discipline of systemic training, not individual heroism. And it terrified the Japanese in ways their doctrine had not prepared them to process. The contrast between expectation and reality deepened as the campaign ground on. Japanese forces had entered the Philippines with rations calculated for a swift victory. When victory did not come, when the Americans continued to fight from prepared positions that extracted heavy casualties, the Japanese supply situation deteriorated. By February, frontline Japanese units were on reduced rations. Soldiers scavenged for food in abandoned Filipino villages. Malaria and dysentery spread through units that had expected to be celebrating in Manila. Meanwhile, through binoculars and during brief battlefield encounters, Japanese soldiers observed something that violated their understanding of privation and military virtue. The Americans were also starving. This was true. Rations on Bataan had been cut to less than half the normal allocation. Disease ravaged the defenders as thoroughly as it did the attackers, yet the Americans maintained their formations. They rotated men from the front lines to field hospitals and back again. They continued to shave when water was available, maintained their weapons, buried their dead with ceremony. Sergeant Takeo Yamaguchi, captured after the fall of Bataan and later interviewed by American intelligence officers, described watching a group of Marine prisoners being marched to the rear in early April. He had expected to see broken men, starved, diseased, defeated. Instead, he saw soldiers who maintained formation, even in captivity, who helped their wounded walk, who met Japanese eyes with what he described as professional assessment, not fear or hatred. He told his interrogators that this was the moment he first doubted what he had been taught about American soldiers. These were not soft men. They were simply different kinds of hard. The symbolic object that came to represent this dissonance was the rifle. Japanese soldiers carried the Type 38 Arisaka, a weapon that embodied their military philosophy, light, simple, designed for men who valued spirit over sustained firepower. It was adequate for soldiers who expected to close with the enemy, to overcome defensive positions through will and the bayonet. The Americans carried the M1 Garand, a semi-automatic rifle that could deliver accurate fire at a rate the Japanese could not match with their bolt-action weapons. But the rifle itself was not the symbol. The symbol was what it represented, a military system that trusted individual soldiers with powerful tools because those soldiers had been trained to use them with discipline. The Garand required more maintenance than the Arisaka. It was heavier. It was more complex. Yet in American hands it functioned flawlessly because those hands belonged to men who had been taught not just to fire, but to care for their equipment as an extension of their professional identity. Japanese officers noted this in their reports. They described recovering American weapons from battlefields and finding them meticulously maintained despite weeks of combat in tropical conditions. They described captured supply dumps where spare parts and cleaning equipment were organized with what seemed like obsessive precision. This was not the behavior of an army that had given up. This was the behavior of an army that believed it would win eventually, even as it lost ground today. The transformation in Japanese perception accelerated after the fall of Bataan and Corregidor. When the fortified island finally surrendered on May 6, 1942, Japanese forces captured approximately 11,000 American and Filipino troops. What followed was the Bataan Death March, an atrocity that revealed as much about Japanese assumptions as about Japanese cruelty. The Japanese had not prepared adequate transportation or supplies for prisoners because they had not conceived that so many men would surrender alive. In Japanese military culture, surrender was shameful beyond measure, a violation of the code that made a soldier something less than human. Yet these Americans had surrendered as units under orders with their organizational structure largely intact. Even during the march, Japanese guards reported incidents that defied their expectations. American officers attempted to negotiate better treatment for their men, using military courtesy and appeals to international law. Prisoners shared water and food with weaker comrades, sometimes at the cost of their own lives. When Japanese guards demanded that prisoners abandon those who could not walk, American soldiers defied the order, supporting their fellows until beaten or shot for their defiance. This was not the behavior of men without discipline. This was discipline that extended beyond the moment of tactical defeat, that persisted even when the military structure had theoretically dissolved. It was discipline rooted not in fear of punishment, but in something the Japanese had not anticipated: professional identity, unit cohesion, and a belief in mutual obligation that transcended the immediate circumstances. Lieutenant Toshino Junsaburo, who served as a guard during the Death March, later wrote in his memoir that the experience changed his understanding of the war. He had expected the Americans to revert to animal behavior once removed from their command structure. Instead, he witnessed men dying to uphold principles that seemed, from his perspective, almost insane. They protected the weak when survival demanded selfishness. They maintained military bearing when no superior officer was watching. They acted, he wrote, as if they believed someone was keeping score, as if their behavior mattered to some authority beyond the immediate. It did matter. The score was being kept not by any external authority, but by the men themselves, by the culture of the Marine Corps and the U.S. Army that had been internalized so thoroughly that it functioned without external enforcement. As the war progressed and Japanese officers encountered American forces in Guadalcanal, the Central Pacific, and across the island chains, the pattern repeated and deepened. Each battle brought new evidence that contradicted the doctrine. At Guadalcanal, American Marines adapted to jungle warfare with a speed that shocked Japanese commanders who had expected the terrain to be their ally. The Americans learned to move silently, to ambush, to endure the same privations that Japanese soldiers faced, while maintaining the fire discipline and coordination that had characterized their fighting from the beginning. Japanese battle reports from Guadalcanal describe American positions that remained combat effective even when surrounded, that continued to coordinate artillery fire and air support even when communications were disrupted, that refused to collapse even when tactical logic suggested they should. After the battle for Henderson Field, Japanese intelligence officers interviewed survivors and compiled assessments that grew increasingly respectful in tone, even as official propaganda continued to portray Americans as weak and cowardly. The respect was grudging, filtered through a cultural lens that made it difficult to articulate. But it was real. Japanese officers began to distinguish between American units, noting which divisions fought with particular effectiveness, which commanders showed tactical innovation. They stopped expecting easy victories and started preparing for battles of attrition against an enemy that would not break regardless of casualties inflicted. The ultimate symbol of this transformation came not in battle, but in captivity. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, American forces occupied the home islands and began processing millions of prisoners and repatriating Japanese soldiers from across the Pacific. Japanese officers who had survived the war found themselves witnesses to an occupation that contradicted everything they thought they knew about victors and defeated. The Americans did not rape and pillage, as Japanese propaganda had promised. They did not execute prisoners indiscriminately. Instead, they administered the occupation with the same organizational discipline that had characterized their combat operations. They distributed food systematically. They treated Japanese civilians with respect that shocked a population prepared for atrocity. They rebuilt infrastructure, established courts, and began the process of transformation that would turn a militarized empire into a democratic nation. For Japanese officers who had fought the Americans, this was perhaps the most stunning manifestation of discipline, the ability to extend professional conduct beyond the battlefield to treat defeated enemies as human beings worthy of law and mercy. This was not weakness, it was power so complete that it did not need to prove itself through cruelty. Colonel Tsuji, who had watched the Americans retreat into Bataan 4 years earlier, survived the war in hiding and eventually returned to Japan. In his post-war writings, he attempted to reconcile what he had witnessed with what he had believed. He wrote about the American Marines with a respect he granted to few others, describing them as professional soldiers who fought without hatred but with perfect dedication. He noted that Japanese forces had defeated the Americans tactically in the Philippines, but had lost strategically because they had misunderstood what they were fighting. They had been prepared to fight an army. What they encountered was an institution, one that persisted beyond individual battles, beyond temporary defeats, sustained by a discipline rooted in mutual trust and professional identity rather than fear of dishonor. The Marine Corps that Japanese officers encountered in 1942 was the product of nearly 2 centuries of institutional evolution. It was small, professional, and had developed a culture that emphasized individual initiative within structured hierarchy. Marines were taught to think 3 ranks above their current position, to understand not just their immediate task, but how it fit into larger operational goals. They were cross-trained extensively so that every rifleman could perform the duties of the man beside him. They practiced endlessly until basic tasks became automatic, freeing mental resources for adaptation and problem-solving under stress. This was discipline, but not the rigid discipline of automata. It was disciplined flexibility, the ability to maintain cohesion and purpose while adapting to circumstances that doctrine had not anticipated. When American forces in Bataan found themselves cut off from supplies, they manufactured ammunition from scavenged materials. When standard tactics failed against Japanese infiltration, they developed new methods within days. When individual leaders were killed, subordinates stepped forward without orders because they understood the mission and their role within it. Japanese officers, trained in a system that emphasized vertical hierarchy and obedience to specific orders, struggled to counter this. Their soldiers fought with incredible courage and would execute suicidal charges without hesitation. But when plans failed, when unexpected situations arose, the Japanese system often froze. Initiative was not encouraged at lower ranks. Deviation from orders was punishable. The result was an army that could be devastatingly effective when everything went according to plan, but brittle when faced with chaos. The Americans seemed to thrive in chaos. Their discipline was designed for it, for maintaining purpose and cohesion when everything else was falling apart. This was the discipline that stunned Japanese officers, not because it was stricter than their own, but because it was fundamentally different in character and purpose. As the Pacific War ground toward its conclusion, as Japanese forces faced defeat after defeat, the cognitive dissonance became unbearable for many officers. Some rationalized that Americans won through material superiority alone, that numbers and industrial capacity explained everything. This was comforting because it preserved the myth of spiritual superiority even in defeat. Others, like Colonel Tsuji, could not escape the evidence they had witnessed, that American soldiers were not weak, not soft, not undisciplined. They were simply disciplined toward different ends in service of a different conception of what it meant to be a professional warrior. The epilogue to this story extends beyond 1945. In the post-war period, as Japan rebuilt its self-defense forces under American guidance, former Imperial Army officers had to study and internalize the very principles they had once dismissed. They learned about decentralized command, initiative at junior levels, professional standards divorced from Bushido ideology. They learned that discipline could serve democracy as effectively as it had served empire, that soldiers could be trusted with power without becoming tyrants, that military effectiveness and respect for human dignity were not contradictory. The stunned recognition that Japanese officers experienced when facing US Marines in 1942 was ultimately a confrontation with a deeper truth about the relationship between individual freedom and collective purpose. The Americans had not been weakened by their democracy. They had been strengthened by it because their discipline was voluntary, chosen and maintained by men who understood why they fought and what they protected. It was discipline rooted in mutual respect between leaders and led in belief that individual dignity and military effectiveness could coexist, in trust that soldiers given responsibility would rise to meet it. This was the lesson written in blood across the Pacific, that an army of free men properly trained and led, disciplined by professional pride rather than fear of dishonor, could stand against any force on earth. Not because they loved death less, but because they loved life enough to risk it for something larger than themselves. The Japanese officers who witnessed this discipline learned what they had not wanted to believe, that freedom, far from being weakness, could forge warriors as formidable as any the world had seen, warriors who carried their discipline not as a chain, but as a choice renewed with each action, sustained not by fear, but by faith in themselves and in one another. That faith, manifested as discipline unexpected and unyielding, was what stunned them most of all.